Hi everyone, thanks for inviting me tonight. So I'm going to be chatting through some of the new technology that we've been developing at the National Oceanography Centre. So I'm in the coastal processes group, and I'm interested in collecting new data about wave overtopping hazard, but also understanding all of the processes that can change that hazard. So waves overtopping a seawall, they can pose hazard by the water that comes over the wall, but also the debris that's within those waves. So when we think about wave overtopping, we have images of large plumes of spray flying up into the air, going over the top of seawalls. And this can draw people towards the edge of the seawall to take photos, as we can see on the image on the slide. We also have to be concerned about buildings that are in the impact zone of these waves, and also any transport links, so the waves can go over, impact trains where train lines, or cars where there's roads that run along coastlines. So it's very important to understand the processes that actually cause waves to go over the top of the seawalls, and also the amount of water that they can carry over the top of a seawall and inland, as they pose a flood hazard and also a safety hazard to people. They can knock people over, and also to vehicles and property. So if the debris is travelling at speed, it can very easily smash windows, which could be a car windscreen or the windows on a property. So with climate change and rising sea level, we really need to understand what's going on and be able to predict what might happen in the future, so we can adapt and start to live safely with these waves that come over our sea defences. So there's a lot of uncertainty when we try and predict the waves that go over the top of sea walls, and this impacts the design of new sea walls. So sadly, when new sea walls are built, they cost a lot of money, but they can also receive a lot of media attention when things don't go quite to plan. So here's an example of a seawall that was designed and built in Blackpool, but soon opened, a storm impact caused some of the material to be lifted during a storm event. So of course this caught the eye of the media. That doesn't mean that the seawall isn't performing to its design standards. It just means there was some facial impact that needs to be put right. So to be able to improve the way we design seawalls and also try and reduce the costs that are incurred with their maintenance, and also fixing any damage that can occur, we need good predictive tools to be able to help the designers. So why is there uncertainty within these predictions? Well, that's because there's very limited field observations to be able to validate and calibrate the numerical tools and the computer simulations that we use to predict how water might travel over the top of a structure at the coast. HR Wallingford have used tanks in the past, and they've installed them behind a seawall to collect the water that's flying over the top. But as you can see in the photo, these tanks can be very large, so they're very awkward to move into position. You can't keep them in the cupboards, and when you get a hazard forecast, drive to the beach and pop them out, which means they're quite costly to be able to install. They also have large surface areas themselves. So when the waves fly over the seawall and go into the tanks themselves can actually move, which can cause damage to the structure that they're positioned on. So this is quite a challenging environment to be able to collect data in. The other challenge is the fact we have no real-time information about beach levels. So here we've got a photo of someone collecting a beach level as they're walking up and down transects on the beach. And during my studies, I've been collecting information about the profile of sea defences, where waves are run up and can go over the top of sea walls. Now, the reason we don't collect real-time information is because we haven't got the instruments installed at the beach to be able to be permanently scanning the beaches. And to send teams to the beach more than a couple of times a year is actually very costly, because it's very time-consuming to go out at low tide and start collecting these transects. You have to cover a huge amount of space across a beach area. So normally local councils collect a beach level at the end of summer before the winter storms come, and also at the end of winter, so they know the response that's happened that winter. Occasionally, when a large storm occurs, they also go out and get a post-storm profile so they can understand the beach levels. But without a good detailed understanding of the beach level, it's very hard to predict how the waves travel across the beach before they impact a structure. And this can also introduce uncertainty in the predictions. A lot of our overtopping data, because it's very high energy and in quite harsh environments, also comes from scaled laboratory studies. This is HR Wallingford's flume facility. So within the flume, we can generate a lot of data, but sometimes we miss the interactive processes that occur in the real world. So you can't always have wind included within your flume. Sometimes the waves come up at an angle, but your flume is kind of a long, thin transect. Also, it's very rare to get beach level change within a flume because it's a concrete base and we don't always want to fill them up with sediments. So there are limitations with using laboratory data. So the challenge to the NOC and also members of HR Wallingford was, could we transfer our understanding and our technology to actually start collecting field measurements of wave overtopping? So what we did, HR Wallingford are very experienced with using instruments within the lab, and they understand what type of data needs to be collected. At the same time, we have a team that work in the open ocean collecting air-sea flux information, and they collect data about breaking waves at sea. And they use spar buoys, which is shown in the photo, with capacitance wires on them to measure these breaking wave processes. So we thought we could put these capacitance wires onto a scaffolding rig and start measuring the dense wave spray at the coast. And the system we came up with is called Wirewall. And hopefully this little video will play for you, showing how the waves travel through the wirewall, and the wirewall collects information about the speed and the discharge of all of the individual waves passing through it. So this was one of the very first deployments of the wirewall system. It's in Crosby, just north of Liverpool. And you can see that what happens, the waves aren't particularly large, but they are still going over the top of the seawall due to onshore windy conditions under spring tide. So the water levels are very high, enabling the wave spray to shoot up the seawall, and then the wind carries it over the top. So I'll just play that again. So the wave runs up, hits the seawall, get a good splash, and then as the plume of water is in the air, the wind is able to blow it over the top. You then get quite a large volume of water on the walkway. So if you were a pedestrian, if you had been knocked over, there's a risk that you could have been then rolled over the seawall and onto the stepped revetment on the beach, and you'd be on the impact zone. So this is why we want to understand the processes of wave overtopping. So this is our case study site just north of Liverpool. We can see that the concrete in this area on the seawall is degrading. So any of the data we collected will be used to help refurbish this scheme or advise on the conditions that impact this location if a new scheme is built in the future. The car park that we deployed in is shown at the bottom, so we can see that there is a flood hazard there. The water is nearly reaching the van on this windy springtide conditions. So it's not somewhere you really want the public parking during stormy winter conditions. So being able to forecast when these conditions will occur is quite important. So before we went to the beach, we have to know that our system works, and we have to be able to process the data that comes from the system. So we started off running dockside tests, which means we were throwing buckets of water through the capacitance wires. So in the photo, we have 3 wires, W1, W2, and W3, and a jet of water is being thrown through them. And this generates the graph that we see. So W1 is the blue line, then W2 is the red line, and W3 is the green line. So the capacitance signal shoots up and creates a spike when the water makes a contact with these wires. We then use the knowledge of when these wires are hit, the spacing between them, and the depth of water on the wires, which is proportional to the spike in the data, to calculate the speed and the discharge of the water passing through an array of wires. The little green circle is highlighting that the wires are able to detect small 1 centimetre droplets due to their spacing. So it's a very high accuracy system that can measure spray. So once we'd finished at the dockside tests, we then went to HR Wallingford's flume facility to test it under control in a controlled environment where we knew which waves we were sending at the seawall, and we could control the water levels. And behind the seawall, we could collect the water within a tank to compare the volumes with those measured by the wire wall system. We could also test things like wire thickness to understand issues that could occur at the beach. So at the beach, if debris is brought up through the system, there's the potential for a wire to snap. And this is why we have many wires. So if one is broken during a storm, the others still continue to collect data. So we have redundancy within the system. So within the flume, we could test different wire thicknesses and what would happen under different conditions. So this is slides just showing the flume. We have the wire wall system positioned by the scale model of the Crosby sea wall. So because the flume doesn't have wind, instead of a nice plume of spray going up and over the seawall, it is more of a surging condition. But this is fine because all we really want to be able to achieve in the flume is being able to compare the wire wall data with the tank data and checking that both get similar volumes. So this slide is just showing some of the results. So what happens is the blue line and the cyan coloured line are the wire wall data, and the red line and the magenta are the tank data underneath the wires. The blue and the red are the data close to the seawall, collecting high volumes of water going over, and the cyan and the magenta are set further inland, so they receive less water. So that's why the graph lines on the blue and the red are very steep, and the graph lines for the magenta and the cyan are much flatter gradients. So what we can see is initially the red line and the blue line follow each other. So wire wall is predicting the same volume of water going into the tanks as the tanks are collecting. And the cyan and the magenta lines follow each other. But at about 300 seconds, the red line suddenly flattens off, and that's because the tank becomes full. So that's one advantage of wire wall over tanks. It can't fill up because it's an open structure. The waves continue to pass through it. So there's no risk of the system being dislodged by the waves because it's very open-faced, and also it can't fill up with water. So it can measure for the full duration of a storm when it's out at the beach. So this is then what the deployment looks like. This is a camera that was positioned on the back of the rig, and we've got 18 wires here in rows of 6, measuring the waves that go through them. So the water comes up the seawall, some of it's deflected back offshore due to the recurve in the seawall, but because there's an onshore wind, quite a lot of it can also splurge onshore and come through the rig. And these are the results from one of the very first deployments. Each coloured line represents the position of a wire going inland. So the red is the first wire, which is at the very edge of the seawall, and the cyan, which is the flattest line, is the 6th wire, which is the inlandmost wire. So from the wire wall, we can collect the cumulative volume of water that goes over the seawall during a tidal cycle. The vertical black line is showing high tide. So quite a lot of the water comes over during the flood tide, and then a lot less comes over during the ebb tide. So that's a rapid increase in the lines, and then they flatten off. You can also get a time series of the data by looking at the individual wires. Now, the cyan line here is a prediction using one of the predictive tools that HR Wallingford have developed. The vertical black line is showing when high tide is, and the cyan line is very symmetrical either side. So as the tide comes in, overtopping increases, and as the tide goes out, overtopping decreases. And that's because the water level is coming in and out and bringing the waves towards the seawall, up the seawall, back down the seawall, and then back out along the beach. The squares are showing the predictions by wire wall. So the purple is the wires very close to the edge of the seawall, and the green points are the wires just inland of the railing. So we think it's at the point of the railing is the best point to compare observations with numerical predictions. And that's because we know at the railing, the water is crossing the edge of the seawall and is posing a hazard to the pedestrians. Now, the wire wall observations, they start much earlier than the predictions, and they have much higher values on the flood tide. Then on the ebb tide, they rapidly drop off and they match the predictions. So we know there's asymmetries happening at the coast here that we aren't capturing in the numerical predictions. And we think this is due to the flood and ebb of the tide and the currents refracting the waves towards or away from the sea wall. So the wire wall is able to identify things that are missing within predictions to try and capture more processes in our predictive capability. So predictions at this site are critical to forecast the flood hazard to be able to close the car park where the wire wall was deployed. I'm quite happy to take any questions now if anyone does have anything in the chat before I go on and show how it was deployed with other people to start looking at the role of beach levels. So far, I've just chatted through the development of a new instrument that can make individual wave overtopping measurements. It can measure the volume of the individual waves or the volume of the water that goes over a seawall during the tidal cycle. And it can also measure the horizontal speed of the water travelling through the rig. It can give us a time-varying description of overtopping at the site where it's deployed. And it can also give us a landward distribution of that information, which helps people planning structures. So if they're putting in buildings in a port or a dock, they know where the impact zone might be. Or if they're building train line operators, they know which train lines are greatest hazard and at what point the trains might need to be stopped due to the overtopping flow. So I don't know if we have any questions in the chat or
None
anything.
here. None here.
No.
Though I would ask one quick question myself. Would it not be possible to use LiDAR data packages from satellites to do the measurements of your beach profiles, or possibly LiDAR through a drone, which might be more cost effective and sustainable?
Yep. So a LiDAR can measure beach profiles, and the Plymouth University are already using a LiDAR system called B-Scan, and they have it scanning every low tide at certain locations where it's deployed. So I guess the challenges with LiDAR are the battery power. So you need to be able to power the instrument to run for long term. And it can be installed, and you need to be able to train people to install it and also download the data. Some people are also using LiDAR to look at wave overtopping, but that only measures the solid water that can go over the top of a seawall because it measures depth changes, and it doesn't measure spray because it won't get the data in between the individual droplets that the wires can pick up. People are also starting to analyse satellite images to look at beach levels as well. But because of cloud cover and issues with when the satellite passes and how frequently it passes, they often have to apply averaging processes. So you would get probably an average beach profile every couple of weeks. So you still might not get that beach level just before a storm impacts. I think at the minute they're mainly looking at seasonal changes within beach level using satellite data.
Right, we've got a question from Nigel. Have there been any other overseas techniques or techniques used in this process?
Yeah, so there's a lot of interest in this overseas. There's a lot of coastal structures that are at risk of waves going over the top of them. People are looking at lasers, laser scanners, and they're also looking at optical instruments. So the water breaks the optical beam. But again, the challenge here is that we're looking at spray. In the UK, we've got a lot of vertical seawalls. So we end up with this dense plume of spray in the air that the wind can act on and bring inland over the seawall if it's an onshore wind. We think about the Netherlands, they have very grassy embankments. So the water overtopping that is kind of very surgy in nature. It's like a jet of water surging up the edge of the embankment and over the top. So in those locations, laser and optical instruments work fine because they're looking for single depth changes. So the challenge here is, how do we measure dense spray droplets going over the top of the seawall?
So did that answer your question, Nigel?
I'm going to assume that's a yes.
Righty ho then. Okay, no other questions have come up, so if you want to carry on.
Carry on. So now we've got a system that we can install. We've started working with others, and we're trying to collect data of the overtopping along with beach levels, along with the weather conditions, to understand how all of the different processes interact. So during 2021 to 2022, we had a set of systems installed along the Dawlish railway line with the University of Plymouth. And between us, we collected concurrent information over that annual period. So in the photo, on starting with the number 1 circled in yellow, we have a camera system that's overlooking everything. So we've got some visuals of what's going on. Then 2 and 3 are the wire wall systems. Number 2 is showing a wire wall very similar to the one that was at Crosby. This one's 3 meters high and has 6 wires on it. And then the 2 number 3s are smaller wire wall systems that we're calling wire wands, that can just collect information about the frequency and the duration of the wave overtopping. So we know when the water reaches the wall that's between the pedestrian walkway and the rails, and also the garden fence between the housing and the railway line. And then on the far side, number 4, we have a laser scanner, which is called B-Scan, and it looks down onto the beach and it scans the beach every low tide. On the face of the seawall, we also had an extra wire dangling over to see if we could start measuring the run-up on the face of the seawall, to start understanding the triggers between when the run-up is surging up the face and when it starts going over the top of the seawall. So the beach scanning system, which is basically a LiDAR system, was used to collect the variation in the beach level over the seasons during that deployment. At Dawlish, the Plymouth Coastal Observatory collect beach levels twice a year, so they get the seasonal data, and those beach levels are used to forecast hazard in the southwest region. So the map is showing all of the lines, all of the transects that Plymouth Coastal Observatory already survey. So our deployment is very close to one of those lines and can collect extra information. So the profile image of the seawall is showing all of the different beach levels that occurred during our deployment. Now at Dawlish, there is a concrete toe at the very bottom of the seawall. So you have the beach and then a concrete step became exposed. So that means the very edge of the seawall is pretty static. But in some locations, the beach does build up and go up and down the face of the seawall, which really does change how the waves impact it. And these are some of the visuals we have from Plymouth's camera. So we've got the trains going along, and we've got our system while we've got the waves going over the top. So at this site, Network Rail are very interested to compare their hazard forecasts with our observations, just to understand at what times of the tide the biggest risk are to the trains. because at this site, they will actually delay the trains, put speed restrictions on them, and when it becomes very severe, they'll cancel trains. In this video, we're seeing that the trains are still running along the edge of the seawall. But if it gets stormier than this, they will run trains on the inland track along the edge where the houses are. So instead of two-directional train line, you end up with a single line, and the trains have to take it in turns to go along the Dawlish Warren area. It causes delays, which then incurs costs for Network Rail. And this is the forecast system that the University of Plymouth run. It's the operational wave and water level model, which we call OWL. So it uses wave and water level data that come from the Met Office operational forecasts. And then this is input into predictive tools to predict the overtopping at all of the points in the map. So the green is showing a low hazard, then orange diamonds are plotted when there's a hazard to pedestrians and property, and the red triangles show when there's a serious hazard to pedestrians, property and vehicles. So these numerical predictions enable us to turn on and off processes and try and understand what's going on at a beach, but it also gives us a baseline to identify where numerical predictions might be missing processes at this coast. So this slide shows us the role of the beach level within predicting wave overtopping. So the black solid line are the predictions over a number of tides from the OWL forecasting system at Dawlish. And this is based on the beach levels collected by Plymouth Coastal Observatory. The purple shading is then all of the overtopping predictions that would have been made if we used a number of the beach levels from the line that the B-scan system collected. So this is the full range of beach level change that we saw during our deployment. So we can see that the overtopping can increase by up to a factor of 2 in some cases, just because the beach level has changed. And that's why it's very important to have an accurate beach level within your service, because you don't want to issue false alerts or missed alerts. And you want people to be confident in your predictions if they're using them to go about their daily business. So all of this data, it becomes available in research projects, but what we wanted to do is be able to network the information with existing monitoring that occurs in the Southwest region. So the Plymouth Coastal Observatory already have a number of wave buoys out, they have a number of tide gauges out, and they have a number of met stations. The Environment Agency also have tide gauges, and they also have river gauges. So we've started to try and bring all of this information together online in near real time. And that's so people can have access to all of the different hazard information at one location online to start being able to build decision support tools. So we need decision support tools to be able to help planners so they can actually respond to weather in near real time, so they can have good understanding of what is happening at their coasts and how the weather is impacting the infrastructure that they're responsible for. So this is the online hazard dashboard that we produced within this project. So we have a little map view, and you can select the wire wall instrument you're interested in. This then brings up a set of dots that are color-coded as a traffic light warning system. So every kind of splattering of dots is a tide. When they're red, there's a high hazard of overtopping. And when they're green, it's quite low volumes of overtopping. And below them, we're also pulling in all of the data that's available through existing monitoring networks. So we have a graph of the tides, the winds and the wave conditions. So we know the wave height, the wave period, the wave direction, the wind speed, the wind direction. So from this, we start to understand the coastal source of hazards and also the overtopping impact. And then if we also bring in the Plymouth's B-scan, we start to understand the beach level response to those coastal hazards as well. So while the science is very interesting and analysing data and sharing it with those that are in decision-making roles is important, it's also good to get people involved, because people and citizen science enable more sustainable ways to measure beach change, which is important with climate change because we need to monitor trends in the impacts at our coastline. So alongside the Dawlish installation, we also developed an augmented reality coastal walk. So it's a self-guided walk that has a phone app that enables people to do a 30-minute walk along the coastline and actually have visuals of stormy conditions while they're enjoying the beach on a nice hot sunny day. The walk goes past the coast snap post, which overlooks the brand new seawall that's been implemented near Dawlish Station. And the coast snap post enables them to put their phone within a cradle to take a photo of the beach levels against the seawall and upload it to the Plymouth Coastal Observatory website. These photos are all taken in exactly the same orientation and location due to the cradle. So it means they can all be overlaid to start generating time-lapse information of the beach level change. And over many years, this will start to build up to show trends, not just the seasonal cycle, but the trends, long-term trends in the beach levels at this site. And this is important because scour at the Turver seawall can pose a failure hazard, which we don't want. And also, lowering beaches enable larger waves to impact a seawall, so you get more overtopping hazards. So there's more risk to the trains and also the pedestrians on the platforms waiting for the trains. So since we installed the Coast Snap post, we've had hundreds of photos uploaded, and we've already started to put together a time lapse, which is included within the augmented reality within the phone app. So this little video that was playing just shows a time lapse. So we can see that you've got the tide coming in or out, depending when the person was there. And you've got changes in the tide line. You've got changes in the beach level. And because the Coast Snap post went in very recently after the new seawall was built, we can look at the changes in the beach in response to the seawall as well. So from all of this work, we're hoping that these new prototype sensors, whether it's the system measuring the beach levels, the system measuring the overtopping, they can all start to lead to methods to have the first smart seawall. So we're living in a world where everything is starting to become automated and run through APIs, and information is available online. And we start to talk about the Internet of Things a lot more. So we're hoping that these sensors in the future could be made much smaller. They could be run by other people, and they would be able to enable observation-based nowcast services, providing information in near real time to both the public and those who are responding to hazard or managing hazard. So if anyone's got any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.